$14.20 usually just buys you a cold sandwich from a hospital vending machine. For Delia Marsh, $14.20 bought her the undivided attention of the most dangerous man in Baltimore. It was 2 a.m, 12 hours into the back end of a night shift in the emergency room, and she stood in line at an all-night pharmacy still carrying the smell of antiseptic on her skin. Ahead of her was a small, stooped old woman in a wool coat frayed at the cuffs, though the fabric itself was strangely, expensively soft. She was counting out crumpled bills from a worn leather purse, and she was still $14.20 short. The tired night pharmacist asked her which one she wanted to put back, the heart medication or the blood pressure pills. There was no cruelty in the question. It was simply the flat, sandpaper truth of minimum wage at 2 a.m. But Delia watched the old woman's shoulders drop, watched 2 hands laced with old burn scars tremble against the counter, and she understood at once what 8 years of nursing had taught her to see. These were not the hands of someone being properly looked after. Delia had $61 in her checking account that night. Her brother's care facility bill was 3 months past due. She stepped forward anyway, put the money on the counter, and told the pharmacist to keep the change. As the old woman bent to put her purse away, a small leather-bound book slipped out and hit the floor. Delia picked it up and handed it back without ever looking inside. She walked home, slept 4 hours, and thought it had been an ordinary Tuesday like every other ordinary Tuesday. She did not know that across the city, behind 3 sets of iron gates, a man was replaying security footage of her face. Some kind acts pass through the world and no one remembers them. Others drag you straight down into the dark. If Delia's story stayed with you tonight, leave a like so we know you walked the whole road with her. Share it with the one person who came to mind while you were listening. Chances are they need to hear it too. And subscribe so you don't miss the story we tell next week. 3 nights later, the shift began at 7 o'clock in the evening, and Delia Marsh had been standing behind the curtain in Bay 4 for 11 minutes when the second stretcher was wheeled in. The man on it had fallen from a scaffold. He was conscious, but his breathing was shallow, and he kept insisting that he was fine, that he still had to go home and pick up his wife. Delia didn't argue with him. She simply placed 2 fingers against his wrist, counted his pulse, then spoke in the calm, level voice that 8 years in the profession had honed into her. A voice that neither rose nor fell, made no promises, and simply told people what was happening. Lie still and help me. You'll go home to pick up your wife, but not tonight. The man fell silent. People always fell silent when someone spoke to them in that voice. By 9 o'clock, the emergency department had begun to fill, as it did every Friday night. At 10:30, a poisoning case came in. At 11 o'clock, 2 drunken young men argued in the middle of the hallway until security arrived. Delia moved through all of it in soft, soled shoes that made no sound, her hands dry and cracked from sanitizer, tucked into the pockets of her white coat whenever she wasn't using them. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, the monitor at Bed 7 began to sound. Bed 7 belonged to a man of 83 who had been admitted that afternoon with end-stage heart failure. His chart clearly stated that he was not to be resuscitated. The emergency contact section contained only the telephone number of a grandson in another state, and the nurse on duty had called 3 times without receiving an answer. Delia pulled a chair close to the bed. She didn't say much. She only slipped her hand into the old man's, a hand that had already grown cold from the fingertips upward, and sat there beside him. He wasn't conscious, or perhaps he was, and no one could know. But at some point, those fingers tightened around hers, very gently, only once, and then released her. Delia remained there for another 4 minutes, until the monitor became one long, unbroken tone. She eased her hand free, drew the sheet upward, recorded the time on the chart, then walked to the sink at the end of the corridor. She washed her hands for 40 seconds, exactly as procedure required, dried them, and stepped into Bay 3, where a little girl with asthma was waiting. That was the entirety of her ritual. Over the past 8 years, she had done the same thing for 32 people, and she had never once spoken of it to anyone. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the emergency department doors swung open again. 3 men were supporting a 4th, and all 4 were dressed in dark clothes, all 4 silent with the kind of silence that seemed to have been rehearsed in advance. The injured man appeared to be in his early 30s. His face was drained of color, and his left arm had been wrapped with a shirt that was now soaked dark. The man leading them spoke before they had fully crossed the doorway, his voice perfectly composed, saying that his friend had fallen through a glass door, that there was no need to call the police, and that they only needed the wound stitched before leaving at once. The young nurse at the admissions desk glanced toward Delia. This hospital had rules, and everyone knew those rules, and everyone also knew that several times each night, those rules quietly took one step backward. Delia pulled on her gloves, drew the curtain around Bay 6, and told them to lay him down. She didn't ask a single question. She didn't ask which glass door, where it had happened, or what time. She simply cut away the fabric wrapped around his arm, cleaned the wound, disinfected it, and began to stitch. 14 sutures, each one as straight and even as if placed by a machine. The man clenched his teeth but made no sound, and when she turned his forearm over to close the lower part of the wound, she saw it. A tattoo on the inside of his wrist, its ink faded by the passing years, an anchor enclosed within a rope wound around it 3 times. Delia's hand didn't pause. Her expression didn't change. She said nothing at all. But somewhere inside her mind, an old drawer had just been pulled open. She had stitched that tattoo in this same bay at least 11 times over the course of 8 years. She had stitched it when it rested on the arm of a man past 50, and she had stitched it when it rested on the arm of a young man who wasn't yet old enough to drink. Twice, she had signed the death certificates of men who carried that same mark. The newspapers called these men all kinds of names, but in an emergency department at 4 o'clock in the morning, they were only men who were bleeding, and it was always the same, always someone standing outside the curtain saying there was no need to call the police. The young nurse leaned close to Delia's ear and whispered that perhaps they should call security. Delia cut the thread, placed the scissors on the tray, and answered in a voice barely above a breath, "Just do your job." She bandaged the man's arm, told him to change the dressing after 2 days, and told him that he had to return if he developed a fever, knowing perfectly well that he wouldn't come back. The man who had led them in opened his wallet and placed a thick stack of money on the instrument tray, several times more than the hospital bill would have been. Without looking at it, Delia pushed it back toward him and said that the cashier's desk was on the 1st floor, to the left. The 4 men left at 4:40. At 6:50, Delia walked into the underground parking garage, climbed into her old car, and didn't start the engine. There was an envelope in the pocket of her coat. It had been there for 12 hours, traveling with her past bed 7, through Bay 6, through everything the night had thrown into her face. The sender's name printed in the upper left corner belonged to the nursing center where her younger brother lay. She took it out, turned it over in her hands twice, then placed it face down on the passenger seat. She remained sitting there in the car for another 9 minutes, and she didn't open it. She opened it at 11 o'clock that morning, at the kitchen table in her apartment, after sleeping for 4 hours and drinking half a pot of coffee. The letter was 1 page long, printed on official letterhead, with the finance director's scanned signature already placed at the bottom. It was written very politely. It thanked her for her cooperation over the past 3 years. It reminded her that the current outstanding balance on Wesley Marsh's account was $47,000. It said the center was deeply sorry, but under its policy, if the amount wasn't paid or an approved payment plan wasn't arranged within 6 weeks, the center would be forced to discontinue his care and transfer the patient to a state facility. Delia read the entire letter once, then began again from the first line, more slowly this time, as though some sentence might be different on the second reading. Nothing was different. She folded the letter along its original creases, slipped it back into the envelope, and stood it upright in the sugar jar on the table, where she would see it every morning. On Sunday, she drove out to the suburbs. The trip took 50 minutes, and she had followed that same road at that same hour for 3 years. So her hands seemed to drive on their own while her mind remained somewhere else. She stopped at the convenience store near the turnoff and bought the Sunday paper, as she always did. Wes was in the last room at the end of the east wing, in the bed beside the window, because 3 years earlier Delia had stood at the admissions desk for 40 minutes until they agreed to move him. Her brother was 24 years old now, 1 meter and 83 centimeters tall, his shoulders still as broad as they had been when he used to ride his bicycle to the evening shift, and his hair had grown past his collar. Delia opened the curtains to let in the sunlight, placed the newspaper on the table, and did the first thing she did every Sunday. She heated water, spread a towel across his chest, and shaved him. She used a safety razor, working upward from beneath his chin, stretching the skin with her left hand, while drawing the blade in short strokes with her right, and she talked to him as she shaved. She told him about Friday night in the emergency department, about the 2 drunken men arguing in the hallway, about the new nurse who asked her a question every 3 minutes. She spoke to him in the voice of someone talking to a grown man, never raising it, never sweetening it, never making a single word smaller. Then she wiped his face, dabbed a little water over the freshly shaved skin, and opened the newspaper to the sports section. The Orioles had lost 3 games in a row. Delia read the entire report aloud, including the statistical passages she didn't understand herself, because Wes understood them, or he once had, and she saw no reason to leave anything out. When she finished, she folded the paper and told him that if they lost again next week, he wasn't to blame her. The ventilator sounded in its steady rhythm. Outside the window, a lawnmower could be heard. Near noon, the attending physician stopped by, carrying the medical chart and wearing an expression Delia had learned to recognize a long time ago, the expression of someone preparing to say something they had already rehearsed in their mind. He exchanged a few polite words, then sat in the chair across from her and said that perhaps it was time for the family to reconsider the goals of treatment. He used those exact words, reconsider the goals of treatment, the phrase Delia herself had heard hundreds of times over 8 years, and had often stood beside hospital beds, translating into plain language for grieving families. He added that there had been no meaningful improvement in 3 years, that everyone understood the financial burden, and that sometimes loving someone meant knowing when it was time to stop. Delia let him finish. She didn't interrupt him, didn't flush, and didn't lower the newspaper. Then she said, very softly, that she worked the night shift, and she didn't abandon a patient in the middle of a shift. The doctor looked at her for a moment, then nodded, stood, left the chart on the table, and walked out. Delia stayed for another hour. She trimmed her brother's fingernails, rubbed lotion into both of his elbows because his skin tended to crack at this time of year, then closed the curtains halfway so the sunlight wouldn't fall directly across his face. Before leaving, she bent down and told him she would come again next week, and she said it in exactly the same voice she would have used when making plans with a friend. On Monday afternoon, she took the ring to the shop at the corner of Baltimore and Charles. It was her mother's wedding ring, made of 18-karat gold, with 2 initials engraved inside that had nearly worn away, the only thing left after Delia sold her old car during the first year and finished paying her mother's hospital bills during the second. The shop owner examined it through a magnifying glass, weighed it, tapped figures into a calculator, and offered her $800. Delia said $900. He looked at her, looked at the nurse's uniform she hadn't yet had time to change out of, then opened a drawer and counted $900 onto the glass counter. She took the money and reached the door before stopping. She turned back and asked how long he would keep the ring before selling it. He told her 30 days. She thanked him, wrote the shop's telephone number on the back of the receipt, and stepped outside. On the sidewalk, she stood and calculated the amount once more, even though she had been calculating it since morning. $47,000 minus $900. $46,100 remained, and she had 5 weeks and 4 days left. At 3 o'clock on Wednesday morning, Delia went down to the staff break room in the basement to finish the container of noodles she had left untouched since midnight. The room stood at the end of a long corridor beside the laundry area, and at that hour, it always carried a collection of sounds all its own. The industrial dryers rumbling beyond the wall, the ventilation pipes trembling faintly overhead, the vending machine in the corner giving a low mechanical groan every 15 minutes. Delia sat in her usual plastic chair, lifted the lid from the container, and had eaten exactly 3 spoonfuls when every one of those sounds stopped at once. They didn't fade away. They stopped together, as though someone somewhere had pulled a single lever. She looked up. The break room door opened very slowly, without so much as a creak, and 2 men in dark coats stood in the hallway. They didn't come inside. They simply remained there, one to the left of the doorway and one to the right. Then a 3rd man entered. He appeared to be in his early 30s, tall, with dark brown hair swept back, and he wore a wool coat that Delia was certain cost more than 3 months of her salary, though she couldn't understand why that was the first thing that came to mind. He didn't look around the room. He walked straight to the table where she was sitting, pulled out the plastic chair across from her, and sat down as though the room belonged to him. Delia set down her spoon. She thought of the security button beside the door, 4 steps from where she sat, and she thought of standing up, and she did neither. "What can I do for you?" she asked, and she hated the way her voice remained calm and level, because her heart was pounding somewhere near her throat. The man placed both hands on the table. He wore no ring and no watch. There was only a faint scar crossing the outer edge of his left eyebrow, and a pair of pale gray eyes that revealed nothing at all. "Miss Marsh," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was deep and very quiet, so quiet that Delia had to lean slightly forward to hear him clearly, and only much later did she understand that this was the point, that some men never needed to raise their voices because every room they entered fell silent on its own to listen. She asked how he had gotten inside. The building required access cards. There were cameras. There were security guards. He told her that his family had held the security and medical waste disposal contracts for the entire hospital system for 20 years, that he hadn't broken in, that he had entered through his own door. He said it as calmly as another man might speak about the weather. And Delia sat still, while a cold thought traveled down her spine, the realization that she had passed through those doors twice a day for 8 years and had never, not for a single second, been beyond this man's reach. He continued, without speaking any faster or slower. "You work from 7 o'clock in the evening until 7 o'clock in the morning, 4 shifts a week, sometimes 5. You park in Section B of the basement garage, in the second row from the column. Your account held $961 this morning, 900 of which came from selling a ring at the shop on the corner of Baltimore and Charles on Monday." Delia said nothing. She felt blood beating at both temples, not from fear, but from the sensation of being stripped bare beneath the fluorescent lights, and she lowered her dry, cracked hands beneath the table, out of his sight. "My name is Raphael Orsini," he said. She had heard that name before. Everyone who lived in this city had heard that name, and 3 nights earlier, in Bay 6, she had placed 14 stitches in an arm marked with an anchor enclosed by a rope wound around it, and she had pushed a thick stack of money back toward the man standing outside the curtain. "The old woman at the pharmacy is my grandmother," Raphael said. Then he paused, and Delia waited for the words "thank you," but they never came. Instead, in that same quiet voice, he asked what the old woman had said to her that night. Delia blinked. Of all the replies she had prepared in her mind during the past 10 seconds, not one had been meant for that question. She said the old woman had thanked her and had told her that someone would be glad to know a person had been kind to her. Raphael asked again whether his grandmother had said anything else. Had she mentioned an address? Mentioned anyone's name? Said anything about a shop? Delia answered no, and she was telling the truth, and she saw something very slight pass through those gray eyes and disappear. Something 8 years in an emergency department had taught her to recognize at once, the expression of someone finally breathing out after holding their breath for a very long time. Only then did he reach inside his coat. He took out a thick white envelope, placed it on the plastic table between her cold noodles and her spoon, and pushed it toward her with 2 fingers. $75,000, he said. Cash. Delia looked at the envelope. It lay there, white and square and utterly silent. And another number rose automatically in her mind, $46,100. With 5 weeks and 1 day remaining, she asked what the money was for. Raphael Orsini didn't call it a gift of gratitude. He said, "Miss Marsh, my grandmother is 81 years old, and there are days when she doesn't know what year she's living in, and on nights like that, she has a habit of telling strangers things she shouldn't tell them." He tapped one finger lightly against the envelope. "This money is to make sure that whatever my grandmother told you stays inside that pharmacy." Delia looked at the envelope longer than she wanted to admit. In those 8 seconds, she paid off the $47,000 debt, bought back her mother's ring before the 30 days ran out, signed Wes up for 2 more years of care in the last room at the end of the east wing, with the window overlooking the lawn, and slept through an entire night for the first time in 3 years. She did all of it in her mind, quickly and clearly, the way people calculated a medication dosage. Then she raised 2 fingers to the tabletop, placed them against the edge of the envelope, and pushed it back toward Raphael Orsini. She pushed it slowly because her hand was trembling and she didn't want him to see, and she knew from that very second that he already had. There was nothing noble in the gesture. She didn't fling it away. She didn't stand. She simply remained seated in the plastic chair in the staff break room with the container of cold noodles beside her, her dry, cracked hands still hidden beneath the table, while the image of the letter standing upright in the sugar jar on her kitchen table filled her mind. "I won't take it," she said. Raphael didn't touch the envelope. He left it exactly where it was between them, then asked why, and he asked in the voice of a man who had heard the answer to that question many times and had never once found it interesting. Delia understood perfectly well what he was waiting for. He expected her to speak about self-respect. He expected her to say that she didn't need dirty money, that she had done it because of her conscience, that some things couldn't be bought. And she knew that if she said any one of those things, he would simply push the envelope toward her again and wait, because men like him had sat across from hundreds of people who said such things, and every one of them had eventually taken the money. So she didn't say any of those things. She said, "I've worked in the emergency department for 8 years, Mr. Orsini, and I work the night shift." He didn't interrupt her. Delia continued in the same steady voice she used when reading test results to a patient's family, the voice that never rose or fell because rising or falling didn't help anyone. "Every night, someone is brought into Bay 6, and the people with them say there's no need to call the police. I stitch them up. I don't ask questions. In 8 years, I've stitched that anchor inside the coiled rope tattoo at least 11 times, and twice I've signed death certificates." The younger of those 2 men was 23. "I know what the end of this envelope looks like because I've seen it lying on an emergency room table too many times. Someone always takes the money first, and 6 months later, I'm the one cutting their clothes off. I'm not refusing because I'm clean. I'm refusing because I know the price, and I can't afford to pay it." Then she fell silent. The industrial dryer beyond the wall remained still. Neither of the 2 men in the hallway moved. Raphael Orsini sat motionless, and for the first time during the entire conversation, he truly looked at her, looked at the uniform faded around the collar, looked at the dark circles beneath her eyes, looked down toward the place where her hands were hidden beneath the table. "You calculated it," he said. It wasn't a question. Delia said that was her job, that she calculated dosages all night long, and if she got one digit wrong, someone died. Raphael Orsini gave a very small nod. He picked up the envelope without hurry and slipped it back inside his coat. Then he stood, and the plastic chair didn't make a sound. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I'm going to tell you something so you understand your position. My family has a rule, and that rule is that an Orsini owes no one. Not because we're generous, because an unpaid debt is an opening, and sooner or later, someone else will find a way through it. You've just refused the only way I know to close that opening." Delia asked what he intended to do. Raphael fastened the button of his coat. "I don't know," he said, and it was the first honest thing he had said all night. Then he walked toward the door, and the 2 men in the hallway stepped back to clear his path without needing a signal, and all 3 disappeared in the direction of the emergency stairs. About 4 seconds later, the vending machine in the corner gave a low groan, the ventilation pipe above began trembling softly again, and the dryer beyond the wall started turning. Delia remained seated for a long while in the room, now filled once more with all its familiar sounds. Then she stood, and she had to hold on to the edge of the table because her knees didn't obey her at once. She emptied the noodles into the trash, washed the spoon beneath cold running water, dried it, and put it away in the drawer. At 4:15, she returned to the emergency department and finished the final 3 hours of her shift. As she drove home at 7:20, she told herself it was over. She had said no. She had said it clearly, had explained her reasons, and a man like that didn't waste time on matters that had already been closed. She believed she had cut the thread between them. She was wrong. She had only pulled it tight and tied it into a knot. For the next 4 days, Delia lived in a way she never named aloud, though her body understood it perfectly. She locked the door to her apartment 3 times instead of once, and on the 3rd time, she pulled hard on the knob to make certain it was secure. She changed the route she took to work, abandoning the avenue she had used for 8 years and circling through the lower streets instead, adding 6 minutes to the drive. She began memorizing the license plates of the cars parked along the block in front of her building, and she discovered that her memory was better than she had believed, because by the 3rd day she recognized a dark car that had been there on 2 consecutive mornings, and another car parked in that exact place that evening. She told no one about any of it. On the 4th night, she finally spoke, and the words came out entirely against her will. She was sitting at the nurse's station completing patient charts beside a colleague who had worked in the department 3 years longer than she had, and somehow the conversation wandered until Delia suddenly asked whether she had ever heard of the Orsini family. The other woman stopped typing. Her hands remained on the keyboard, but her fingers no longer moved. She stared at the screen for nearly 3 seconds, then turned toward Delia, and there was no curiosity in her face, no excitement, nothing at all except the expression Delia had seen on the faces of patients' families when a doctor began reading the results of a biopsy. Then the woman asked why she wanted to know. Delia said it was nothing, that she had merely heard someone mention the name. The woman nodded, turned back to the screen, and resumed typing. For the rest of the shift, she never mentioned it again, never asked a single further question, and that silence told Delia more than anything she could have found in a newspaper. On Saturday morning, near the end of her shift, a man was waiting for her beside the emergency department exit. He wasn't dressed in dark clothing, wore nothing on his hands, and looked exactly like any other person heading to a morning shift in the city. He didn't come closer than 2 steps. He handed her a piece of paper folded in half, and said only that the old woman hadn't eaten for 3 days and was asking for her. Then he walked away. Delia stood beside the exit with the paper in her hand and opened it. Inside was nothing but an address written by hand in the northern part of the city, with no name, no telephone number, and not another word. She went home. She slept for 2 hours, then woke and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the paper beside the envelope standing upright in the sugar jar. 3 days without food. She calculated it in her head as though reviewing a medical chart. 81 years old, underweight, a history of heart disease, 3 days without food, where her blood sugar and electrolytes would be by now, and what would happen on the 4th day. She sat there for 20 minutes. Then she changed into a clean uniform, took her keys, and went out to the car. Her old car started on the 2nd attempt, as it always did. She drove north for 40 minutes, beyond the neighborhoods she knew, onto a road that followed the slope of a hill, and she recognized the destination before she ever saw the house number, because a stone wall ran along the right side of the road for nearly 1 kilometer. The first gate opened when she was still 10 meters away, and no one asked her a question. 2 men stood on either side of the second gate, and one of them simply looked at her license plate and nodded. The third gate opened more slowly, and when it closed behind her, Delia looked into the rearview mirror and understood for one brief second that she had just done something she couldn't undo. She didn't know that throughout the entire city, the number of cars permitted to pass through those 3 gates in a single month could be counted on one hand, or that her battered, scratched old car had been recorded before she even had time to switch off the engine. The man who met her on the front steps was in his 50s, with neatly combed silver hair and a straight, dignified bearing, and he introduced himself as Emery Fitch. He didn't lead her through a maze of rooms. He took her coat, asked whether the drive had tired her, asked whether she would like something to drink, and when she said no, he prepared a cup of tea anyway and placed it on the kitchen table without another word. He told her the old woman was in the small dining room and that for 3 days, every tray of food had been carried upstairs and brought back down untouched. He said it with genuine concern in his voice, and Delia would remember that detail for a very long time afterward. Mrs. Rosalie sat at the head of the table, her small body wrapped in a heavy robe, both hands marked with old burn scars resting on the wooden surface. An untouched tray of food stood before her. She looked up when Delia entered, studied her for several seconds, and then her face softened. "Maria," she called. "Where have you been all this time? The dough has been waiting since morning." Delia didn't correct her. She pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, saying she was sorry, that the car had broken down along the way. The old woman nodded and muttered several complaints about modern cars, then looked down at the tray as though she had only just noticed it for the first time. Delia drew the tray a little closer, picked up the spoon, and placed it in the woman's hand instead of feeding her. Then she said, "I'll eat with you." She took a plate from the cupboard, divided half the food onto it, and began eating. Mrs. Rosalie watched her for a while, then lifted her spoon and ate. She ate slowly and stopped twice, but she finished everything. At the threshold of the dining room, having approached without making a sound, Raphael Orsini stood watching the 2 women eat together at the head of the table. He didn't enter. He had spent 4 days and offered a great deal of money without solving his problem, and now he stood there watching it resolve itself in 7 minutes because of a woman who had told him no. He no longer thought about repaying a debt. He thought about something entirely different, something colder and clearer, that the thing he had needed for the past 2 years had just sat down at his family's dining table and picked up a spoon. Mrs. Rosalie set down her spoon, pushed the plate slightly away, and said she needed to lie down because she would have to get up early later. Fitch helped her out of the dining room, and when the sound of their footsteps had completely disappeared at the end of the hallway, Raphael Orsini entered, pulled out the chair across from Delia, and sat down. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't thank her this time, just as he hadn't the last. He said he had an offer, and he presented it in the exact voice of a man reading the terms of a contract, without adding a single unnecessary word. A position as his grandmother's private nurse, living in the house, working either the day shift or the night shift, whichever she preferred. A salary 4 times what she was earning now, full medical insurance effective from the first day, and the entire cost of Wesley Marsh's care at the suburban center would be transferred to the company's employee family benefits program and paid directly by the company, including both the $47,000 debt and every month that followed, with no time limit. When he finished, he fell silent. And this time he didn't push anything across the table because there was nothing to push. Delia remained still. Darkness had fallen beyond the window, and someone had switched on the lights in the courtyard. She looked at the old woman's half-finished plate, then at her own hands resting on the wooden table. This time, she didn't hide them. She said the offer was much better than the envelope. Raphael replied that this was intentional. She went on, saying it was better because it insulted no one. It was legal. It came with insurance, and anyone in her position would sign that very night. Then sign it, he said. Delia shook her head. No, she said, and she spoke so softly that even she was surprised. Raphael asked why. And this time there was something in his voice that hadn't been there in the basement break room. A thin edge of impatience, because he had calculated the possibility that she might refuse cash, but he hadn't calculated the possibility that she would refuse a respectable job with insurance when her brother had only 5 weeks left before being transferred. Delia didn't answer at once. She thought of the letter standing upright in the sugar jar, thought of the $900 and the 30 days at the pawn shop on the corner of Baltimore and Charles, and she understood perfectly well that she was about to do something she would question by the following morning. Then she spoke. Mr. Orsini, you don't want to hire me. You want to buy back that night so it won't be a gift anymore. Raphael didn't move. Delia continued more slowly because she was discovering the truth of it as she spoke. That night, I paid $14 for someone I didn't know. That was a gift. It exists outside all your records. No one owes anyone anything, and you can't tolerate that. Because if I take the envelope, then I become someone who was paid. And if I sign this contract, then I become an employee. And either way, that night disappears from your mind. You don't need a nurse. You need that gift to disappear. For a very long time, no one in the dining room said anything. Raphael Orsini looked at her, and those pale gray eyes didn't move, but something behind them had just shifted, like a door that had remained closed for years suddenly being struck in exactly the right place. He had sat through negotiations with men capable of killing him, and not one of them had ever told him what kind of man he was with such precision, in the middle of his own dining room, in a voice as calm as someone reading laboratory results. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He didn't take out the envelope. He withdrew a thick black business card with a rough surface, and it bore no name, no title, and no logo. Only a string of numbers pressed into the card in ink, the same color as the background, so faint they could only be read when tilted toward the light. He placed it on the table in front of her. He said he wasn't forcing her to sign anything, that she could go home, and that the number could be called at any hour. Delia picked up the card and stood. She thanked Fitch for the tea, speaking to him rather than Raphael, because Fitch had just returned and was standing in the doorway. Raphael followed her as far as the front steps. The night was cold, and 3 cars were parked in a neat row across the courtyard, while her old car sat crookedly at the far end like a typographical error. After she opened the car door, he spoke, and he said it very softly, as he said everything. Miss Marsh, you don't understand what you did this afternoon. Delia asked what she had done. Raphael looked toward the iron gate below the slope. 3 sets of gates connected by a road that led directly to his house. He said that about 5 cars passed through those 3 gates each month, and people knew who all 5 belonged to. This afternoon, there was a 6th. Then he added one more thing, that she could refuse him as many times as she pleased, but she couldn't refuse the fact that someone had seen her pass through. Delia got into the car. She slipped the business card into the pocket of her coat, where she kept her keys and several receipts, then closed the door and didn't think about it again. She wouldn't think of it once during the next 4 days, and it would remain silent at the bottom of that pocket for all 4 of them. Emery Fitch escorted her all the way to the parking area, waited while she reversed, and raised one hand in farewell as she drove down the slope. He remained there until her taillights disappeared beyond the first gate. Then he took out his phone and recorded her license plate. 4 nights later, the shift ended earlier than usual, because the department was quiet, and Delia walked down into Section B of the underground parking garage at 3:40 in the morning. The light above the second row had been flickering since the previous autumn, and maintenance notices had been taped to the column twice without anyone coming to replace it, so the entire line of cars kept brightening and falling dark again in an uneven rhythm. She walked between the two rows with her keys in one hand, her mind still lingering upstairs with a chart she hadn't finished. She heard footsteps behind her when she was about 15 meters from her car, and she knew at once that they didn't belong to hospital employees, because hospital employees entering the garage at that hour walked wearily and dragged their feet, while these two men walked quickly and directly. She turned into the center aisle, trying to reach a brighter place, and the second man was already standing there. There were two of them, neither unusually large, both wearing cheap coats, and the first thing Delia noticed wasn't that they were dangerous, but that they weren't in any hurry. The man blocking her path asked whether she was Miss Marsh, and he asked in the voice of someone who already knew the answer. Then he said, "Orsini's charity project. Isn't that right?" Delia stepped back half a pace, and her back touched the door of another car. The other man added that they had been waiting since 7 o'clock, that they knew she worked from 7 o'clock in the evening until 7 o'clock in the morning, and that tonight she had come out 3 hours early and ruined their entire plan. That was the sentence that turned her blood cold. It wasn't the fact that they were standing there. It was the fact that they knew her shift, knew the hour she usually came through the door, knew it with such precision that someone had to have told them. She kept her voice level. She said she was a nurse, that she was coming home from work, and that she had nothing to do with anyone named Orsini. The man in front of her gave a short laugh and said, "5 cars a month, Miss Marsh. And last Saturday afternoon there were 6. Delia reached into her coat pocket for her phone. Her fingers touched her keys, several receipts, and something hard and thick that she couldn't immediately remember. The other man saw her hand move, stepped forward, seized the collar of her coat, and shoved her. Delia lost her balance. Her right shoulder struck the door of the car behind her, and she fell onto the concrete between 2 rows of tires. She bit her lip as she went down. She tasted salt, and thought, with perfect clarity and remarkable calm, that the cut was about half a centimeter long, that it wouldn't need stitches, only adhesive strips. Her mind worked that way in moments like this, and she couldn't control it. Then she heard a sound at the top of the ramp. It wasn't a car horn or someone shouting. It was only the quiet closing of a car door, followed by the sound of shoes descending across the concrete, steady and measured, never quickening by even a single step. The man standing over her turned his head. Delia saw his face beneath the flickering light, and she saw it change. She had spent 8 years reading people's faces in the emergency department, and she knew that expression, the look of someone who had just understood that what was about to happen to him was something he couldn't stop. What followed happened very quickly, and Delia remembered it afterward only in scattered fragments. She remembered one short, clean sound, only once, and then silence. She remembered that the first man was no longer standing where he had been. She remembered closing her eyes and discovering that it didn't help because she could still hear everything. When she opened them again, the second man had been pressed against the concrete wall between 2 columns, and Raphael Orsini stood in front of him without any sign of haste, one hand resting on his shoulder as though he were keeping him from falling. Raphael leaned close to the man's ear and said one sentence. Only one. And it was brief. Delia was about 7 meters away and couldn't hear a single word. But she saw the man's knees weaken, saw him slide down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, and saw him raise both hands to shield his face even though no one had touched his face at all. Raphael remained where he was. He wasn't finished. Delia could see it in the way he stood, and she understood that if she remained on the ground for another 10 seconds, something would happen that she would have to carry in her mind for the rest of her life. She braced one hand against the concrete and called his name. She called louder than she intended, and her voice broke in the middle. "Raphael, that's enough." He stopped. He stopped immediately, in the middle of the movement, without asking her to repeat herself, without turning his head to consider it, without even the smallest pause between her words and his obedience. He simply removed his hand from the man's shoulder and stepped back. And later, whenever Delia thought about everything that had happened that night, that was the one detail she could never fit neatly into place. She had seen him do what he had just done, but she had also seen a man whose name made an entire city hold its breath stop midway through it simply because a night shift nurse, lying on a concrete floor, had told him to stop. Raphael gave the man on the ground a single word, "Go," and he scrambled to his feet, dragged the other man with him. and both disappeared toward the emergency exit. Then Raphael turned, walked over to Delia, and crouched at a careful distance from her. He took a neatly folded handkerchief from his breast pocket and held it out without touching her. Delia took it and pressed it against her lip. She sat on the cold concrete beneath the flickering light and heard herself say, "They knew what time my shift ended." Raphael Orsini didn't answer. But Delia saw his face in that moment, and she understood that he had just reached the very same conclusion she had. She didn't get into his car immediately. She managed to stand, brushed the concrete dust from her pant legs, walked to her own car, and tried to put the key into the lock, and only on the third attempt did she realize that her hand was shaking too badly to find the keyhole. She stood there holding the ring of keys for nearly 10 seconds, then said, without turning around, "Drive me." Raphael's car climbed the ramp out of the underground garage and entered the main road, and the interior was so quiet that Delia could hear the sound of her own breathing. She sat close to the door, the handkerchief still pressed to her lip, and watched the city drift past outside, the streets she had traveled for 8 years looking entirely different through this glass. She had been silent for about 4 minutes when she spoke, and the first thing she said wasn't thank you. She said, "Those 2 men knew I work from 7 o'clock in the evening until 7 o'clock in the morning." Raphael answered that he knew. She continued, "They even knew what time I usually come through the door, and they mentioned that last Saturday afternoon, 6 cars passed through the gates of your house instead of 5. Raphael said he had heard that too. Delia lowered the handkerchief and turned to look at him. "Then you understand," she said. "Before Saturday, I was only a name on a pharmacy recording. No one knew me. No one needed to know me. After Saturday, I became the 6th car, and 4 days later, 2 men were waiting for me in the basement. You don't need to protect me from them, Mr. Orsini. You're the one who put me in their sights." No one in the car said anything. The driver didn't look back, didn't change speed, and gave no sign at all that he had heard. Delia sat there listening to her own heartbeat, and she realized that she had just said those words to a man whose name, even a nurse who had worked in the department for years, didn't dare mention at the station. Raphael kept his eyes on the road ahead. Then he spoke, very slowly, and said that she was right. Delia hadn't expected that. He continued, saying that he had broken his rules twice because of his grandmother, once by going down into a hospital basement at 3 o'clock in the morning, and once by allowing an unfamiliar car through 3 gates in broad daylight, and that in 20 years, he had never done such things, and the people watching him counted every time he broke his pattern the way others counted heartbeats. "They don't care who you are," he said. "They only care that I stepped outside my routine twice in 11 days, and they want to know why. You were the nearest answer they could find." Delia asked what happened now, and this was the part she had prepared for. She had sat in silence for 4 minutes, and during those 4 minutes, she had already built 3 answers to the 3 offers she was certain he was about to make: a thicker envelope, a contract with additional terms, or a payment sent directly to the nursing center with her signature at the bottom of the page. She had even prepared the voice she would use to say no. Raphael made no offer at all. He said she was going to his house tonight, and he said it as a settled fact rather than a question. She asked what happened after that. He told her she would sleep, and by morning, they would find out who had told those 2 men when her shift ended. Delia waited for the rest. There was no rest. She sat there with 3 refusals already loaded in her mind and nothing to fire them at, and that feeling unsettled her more than the envelope containing $75,000. She asked whether he no longer intended to hire her. Raphael turned and looked at her for the first time during the entire drive. "I'm not trying to buy you anymore, Miss Marsh," he said. "I'm only keeping you alive." Then he faced forward again and said nothing more until the car turned onto the road that followed the hillside. Delia reached into her coat pocket to find the handkerchief that had fallen onto the seat, and her fingers touched the hard, thick object she had forgotten for 4 days, the black business card with the recessed number. She left it where it was. Beneath it, folded into quarters in the same pocket, was the letter from the nursing center that she had taken from the sugar jar that morning and carried throughout her entire shift without understanding why. $47,000. 35 days. She had counted those days every morning while making coffee, and she counted them once more as the car passed through the first gate. The second gate opened, then the third. This time, no one looked at the license plate, because this time she was sitting in his car. The car stopped at the front steps. Fitch was already waiting there even though it was only 4:30 in the morning, and he opened the door for her, saw the cut on her lip, then turned toward Raphael with a question he never spoke aloud. Raphael walked past him and climbed the steps, saying only, "By morning, give me a list of everyone who knew her work schedule." "Yes, sir," Fitch replied in the even voice of a man who had given that answer thousands of times. Delia entered the house with concrete dust still clinging to the shoulder of her coat. And inside that coat pocket was a business card she had never used, and a letter counting down one day at a time, a letter she hadn't told anyone in that house about. During her first 4 days in that house, Delia came to understand something she told no one. That the place felt more like a hospital corridor at 3 o'clock in the morning than a home. They placed her in a room on the second floor, with a window overlooking the bay, and the wardrobe was already filled with clothes that still had their price tags attached, all in her exact size and arranged by color. Delia didn't touch them. On the first morning, she washed her nursing uniform by hand in the bathroom sink, wrung it out carefully, hung it over the heated rack to dry, and wore that same uniform again the following evening. 3 times a day, meals were brought to her room on trays covered with silver lids, and all 3 times she said thank you and left the food untouched. Then, near midnight, she made her way down to the large kitchen on the ground floor, put the kettle on herself, made a cup of black coffee, and drank it standing beside the stainless steel counter. She didn't do it out of stubbornness. She did it because 8 years in the emergency department had taught her that when she was brought into a place she hadn't chosen, the first thing she needed to do was find its boundaries, to discover where people would leave her alone and where they wouldn't. By the 3rd day, she had learned quite a bit. No one stopped her from going into the kitchen. No one stopped her from walking into the back garden. There were 2 passageways where someone appeared whenever she approached, very politely asking whether she needed anything, and she understood the meaning immediately. During the day, she sat with Mrs. Rosalie in the small dining room or in the eastern sitting room by the fire, and she watched the medical team work. They followed every procedure, kept every appointment, administered every dose correctly, maintained spotless records, and did all of it the way people serviced a machine. Each time the old woman confused the year, they gently corrected her and brought her back to the present. Then she became a little more agitated, and they recorded in her chart that the patient was showing signs of anxiety. Delia watched the same thing happen for 3 days, and said nothing because she wasn't anyone in that house yet. Emery Fitch was the only person there who spoke to her as though she were a human being. He showed her how to pass through the security doors, explained which ones required a code, which ones only needed to be pushed, and which doors locked completely after 10 o'clock at night. In the afternoons, he made tea for her, strong black tea, and poured a cup for himself before sitting at the opposite end of the kitchen table. He asked about her work in the emergency department, asked how long she had been there, and when she told him about Wes, he didn't offer a single word of comfort. He only nodded slowly and looked down into his cup for a long while. Then he said that he had a son too. Delia asked what his son did. Fitch replied that the boy's life hadn't gone smoothly, that certain things had happened several years earlier, and he said it in the voice of someone closing a door rather than opening one, so Delia didn't ask anything else. He stood, washed his cup, and before leaving, told her that if she needed anything, she could find him at any hour. On the afternoon of the 4th day, he asked her to carry a folder of nursing records down to the small office at the end of the ground floor corridor because his hands were occupied with a tray. Delia took it downstairs. The room was empty, and the desk lamp had been left on. An open file lay on the desk, not turned face down, not clipped shut, but open to the exact page with a heading printed in bold. She placed the nursing folder beside it and had no intention of reading, but her eyes had already read the words. It was a long-term admission application for a memory care facility in another state, a specialized institution with a secured unit, and on the line for the patient's name were the 3 words, Rosalie Maria Orsini. The proposed transfer date had been left blank. There were 2 signatures at the bottom of the page, and neither belonged to Raphael. Delia stood there for nearly 10 seconds. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor and stepped back from the desk. And Fitch entered, set down the tray, thanked her, and gathered up the file with the effortless manner of someone putting away paperwork at the end of the day. He didn't ask whether she had seen anything. He didn't look down at the desk. He only said that the old woman had slept for 2 hours that afternoon, which was a good sign, then escorted Delia to the door. Delia went upstairs and returned to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and remained there for a very long time, while darkness slowly gathered beyond the window, overlooking the bay. For the past 3 days, She had assumed that the only thing happening in that house was that two men had waited for her in the underground garage, and someone was trying to discover who had told them her schedule. Now she understood that something else was unfolding alongside it. Something quieter. Something that had begun before she ever set foot there. Someone inside that very house was preparing the documents to send the old woman away, and she didn't know whether Raphael Orsini knew about it. Delia couldn't sleep that night, and close to 4 o'clock in the morning, she finally gave up, put on her coat, and went down to the large kitchen to make coffee, just as she had on the previous 3 nights. The ground floor corridor lights had been dimmed, and she had made it halfway when she heard sounds coming from the kitchen. A cabinet door opening and closing, then opening again. She quickened her pace. Mrs. Rosalie stood in the middle of the stainless steel kitchen, barefoot on the cold tile floor, wearing a thin nightrobe, opening each cabinet beneath the counter one by one and closing it again. A sack of flour lay on the island with one corner torn open, leaving a long trail of white powder across the steel surface. There was no one else in the kitchen, no night attendant, no one rushing toward them. And in that moment, Delia understood something she would remember for a very long time afterward, that cameras covered the grounds, the gates, the corridors, the entrances, every part of the property except the family's private living spaces. And the person who had given that order was Raphael Orsini himself, because he couldn't bear the thought of his grandmother being watched inside her own home. The old woman turned at the sound of Delia's footsteps. Her face was deathly pale, both hands trembling, and she spoke at once, her voice breaking, saying that the oven wasn't hot, that Delia should touch it and see that it had gone completely cold, and when the customers arrived at 6 o'clock, there would be nothing to sell. Delia didn't tell her there was no shop here. She didn't tell her what year it was. She didn't say, "You're at your grandson's house." 8 years in the emergency department, and the final 2 years beside her own mother, had taught her that no one ever won an argument against a drifting memory, that people didn't swim against the current, they moved alongside it until they found solid ground. She walked to the large gas range in the center of the kitchen, turned the knob, and the flame caught with a soft rush. She switched on the oven beneath it and opened the door slightly. Then she said, "Listen." Mrs. Rosalie fell silent. The steady sound of burning gas filled the kitchen, and about a minute later, heat began spilling from the oven door, carrying the scent of hot metal and dry air that anyone who had ever worked beside an oven would recognize. Delia took the old woman's hand, the hand covered with old burn scars, and guided it close enough to the open oven for her to feel the warmth. Mrs. Rosalie stood still, her shoulders lowered. "It's hot now," she said. "It's hot now," Delia answered. "I turned it on a while ago." Then she pulled the sack of flour closer across the island, scooped some onto the steel surface, brought over warm water, and made each movement slowly and a little noisily, deliberately allowing the old woman to hear everything she was doing. When she had finished, she pushed the mound of flour toward her and said that she didn't know how to do it, and asked the old woman to show her. Mrs. Rosalie looked at the flour, then she placed both hands upon it, and Delia, who had spent 8 years watching people's bodies betray them, stood there witnessing something she had read about in books but had never seen with such clarity. Memory of events was the first to leave. Names, dates, years, children, grandchildren, houses. The memory held inside the hands was the last to go, and sometimes it never disappeared completely. On days like this, Mrs. Rosalie couldn't remember her own grandson's name, but her hands remembered the rhythm of 42 years perfectly. Fold, press with the heel of the palm, turn it 1/4, fold again, over and over, steady as a drumbeat, neither fast nor slow, requiring no thought. As she worked, she said, "Don't press with your fingertips. You have to press here. Do you see? If you use your fingertips, the dough becomes tough." Delia followed her instructions. She did it wrong and was corrected, did it wrong again and was corrected again, and each time the old woman corrected her, her back straightened a little more. The two women stood kneading dough in the stainless steel kitchen at 4:20 in the morning, while the sky beyond the windows remained black. Then the old woman's hands stopped. She didn't look up immediately. When she finally raised her head, Delia saw that something in her eyes had changed, the fog clearing for an instant in the way no one could predict and no one could hold. And Mrs. Rosalie looked at her, truly looked at her, then asked in a completely different voice, the voice of someone who knew exactly where she was, "You're the nurse, aren't you?" Delia said yes. The old woman nodded slowly. Then she said, Raphael is very good at building walls, you know. He's good at shooting wolves too. But he doesn't know how to live inside the house. He thinks that if he makes people afraid of him, they'll leave him in peace. She looked down at her flower-covered hands, then added more softly that she didn't know who had taught him to live that way, but she was certain it hadn't been her. Delia didn't have time to answer. She looked up, and Raphael Orsini was standing beneath the arched doorway leading to the corridor. He was still wearing the clothes from the previous day, his tie removed, one hand resting against the doorframe as he stood motionless. No one knew how long he had been there. No one had heard him approach. There was nothing on his face. Nothing at all, except for a place along his jaw that had tightened. Mrs. Rosalie turned, saw him, and the clarity in her eyes closed at that exact moment, neatly as a door. The old woman smiled and said, "You're awake early. Have you eaten breakfast yet?" "I've finished kneading the dough." At 10 o'clock that night, Fitch knocked on her bedroom door and said that the master of the house wished to see her in the study. The room stood at the end of the ground floor corridor, with a low fire burning in the hearth, and Raphael sat behind the desk with 2 glasses and an unopened bottle of liquor between them. He didn't pour. He told her to sit, and she sat. Then he said that he owed her an apology. He spoke those 3 words slowly, each one separate from the next, like a man reading aloud in a language he had learned long ago and rarely used, and Delia realized that this was probably the first time in many years he had said them to anyone. He continued, saying that he had brought her into this house and placed her in a room as though putting an object somewhere safe, that he had thought of her as an opening that needed to be sealed rather than as a human being, and that he had been wrong. Delia said nothing. Raphael pushed a sheet of paper across the desk. He told her that the 2 men in the parking garage had been hired hands, paid to investigate, and that the matter had been dealt with that afternoon. He said the threat was gone, that she could return home the following morning, that a car would take her, and that he would pay the entire debt at the nursing center without requiring her to sign anything, do anything, or owe anything, as though the 2 of them had never met. He spoke the final sentence in the voice of a man closing a ledger. He didn't know that everything he had just said was wrong from beginning to end. It would take him several more weeks to understand that the 2 men hadn't belonged to the enemy he suspected, that the night he believed he had brought to a close had only just begun, and that by dealing with the matter, he had erased with his own hands the only trail leading back to this house. But that night, he didn't know. That night he sat there wearing the expression of a man who had finally cleaned up a mess. Delia looked at the paper on the desk. She didn't pick it up. She remained seated with both hands resting in her lap and asked who would turn on the oven for his grandmother at 4 o'clock the next morning. Raphael looked up. Delia continued without speaking faster or raising her voice. At 4 o'clock this morning, she was standing alone in the kitchen, barefoot, and there was no one else in the house. She didn't remember where she was, but she remembered when the dough had to be kneaded, and she'll wake at that hour tomorrow, and the day after, and every day that follows, until the day she can't wake anymore. Your medical team follows every procedure, gives every dose, and keeps every schedule. But each time she confuses the year, they correct her and force her back into the present. And each time they do, she becomes a little more agitated. Then they write in her chart that the patient is anxious and increase the medication. You're paying for a system that's slowly making her worse, Mr. Orsini, and no one in this house dares to tell you. Raphael didn't answer. Delia pushed the paper back toward him, and this time her hand didn't tremble. "I'm not asking to stay," she said. "I'm negotiating." Then she gave him her conditions, one by one, in the exact order she had arranged them in her mind since 6 o'clock that evening. A formal employment contract with a fixed term, a written job description, and proper tax reporting, so that if anyone asked later, she would be a private home care nurse and nothing else. Full authority over all nursing decisions, including the right to dismiss anyone on the medical team if she believed it necessary, with the physician reporting to her rather than the other way around. Wes's expenses would be written into the contract as a signing payment, paid once in full, and stated clearly in writing, not a gift, not assistance, not a favor, and not a debt of gratitude. And she would be free to enter and leave the house whenever she wished, without asking anyone's permission. Raphael asked whether there was anything else. She said there was one more condition. Every Sunday, she visited her brother, and no one was to schedule anything over Sunday afternoon. He remained silent for a long time. Then he said there was one point he wouldn't negotiate, that someone would always accompany her, in a separate car, keeping a distance, and remaining out of sight. Delia considered that for exactly 3 seconds, then nodded. Raphael stood and extended his hand across the desk. She rose and shook it, and his hand was warm and calloused, his grip firm but measured. "Welcome to the service of the Orsini family," he said. Delia replied that she wanted to make one thing clear before signing, so there would be no misunderstanding later. "I worked the night shift for 8 years, sir," she said. "I don't abandon a patient in the middle of a shift. Your grandmother is my patient now. So my decision to stay has nothing to do with you." Raphael looked at her for a moment. Then he sat, opened a drawer, and took out a file Delia recognized immediately from the bold heading on the first page, the same file she had seen on the desk in the small office the previous afternoon. He placed it before her and said that since she was going to sign, she had the right to know what she was walking into. He explained that not every decision in the family belonged to him. There was a council made up of people who carried the Orsini name, and others who had stood beside his father since before Raphael was born, and 3 weeks earlier, the council had taken a vote. They had decided that an 81-year-old woman who spoke to strangers at night was an unacceptable risk. They had already prepared the paperwork for a secured facility in another state. He had stopped them, but he had only managed to buy so much time. Delia asked how much time that meant. Raphael said 60 days. 60 days to prove that his grandmother wasn't a leak. Otherwise, they would send her away, and he told Delia plainly that if that happened, he would be forced to choose between his grandmother and everyone else in the family, and he wasn't certain what choice he would make. Delia sat down again. The letter from the nursing center, counting down 38 days, was still in the pocket of the coat hanging over the back of her chair, and during the past 2 minutes, that letter had stopped counting. But she didn't feel relieved at all. She had just set down 1 clock, only for someone to place another in her hands, larger than the first, and this one wasn't counting down for her brother. On the 4th day after signing the contract, Delia stood at the foot of the staircase and listened to the head nurse speaking to Mrs. Rosalie in the small dining room. The woman was saying, "You did so well. You finished every bite, didn't you?" In the voice people used to praise a 3-year-old child, while the old woman sat silently staring down at the plate before her, her shoulders drawn inward. Delia stepped into the room, thanked the nurse, and asked her to come out into the hallway. Once they were outside, Delia told her plainly that her employment would end that day, that the Human Resources Department would pay everything she was owed, and that the reason was that she had spoken to an 81-year-old woman as though she were a child. The nurse's face flushed. She said she had qualifications and 11 years of experience, and that she would speak to Mr. Orsini about this. Delia replied that she was welcome to do so, that his office was at the end of the corridor. Raphael stood on the 2nd-floor landing. He had been there from the beginning, one hand resting on the banister, and he watched the entire exchange without descending a single step or speaking a single word. The head nurse looked up and saw him, waited, and he still said nothing. That afternoon, she left carrying her suitcase. During the next 3 weeks, Delia rebuilt the rhythm of life in the house around things that were real and could be touched. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the oven was lit, dough was kneaded, 2 small loaves were baked, 1 was eaten, and 1 was left behind. At 7 o'clock, the radio was tuned to a station that replayed old programs, the same songs the old woman had listened to when the bakery was still open. At 9 o'clock, they walked exactly 4 laps around the back garden. In the afternoon, they knitted or folded towels, tasks done with the hands that had a clear beginning and a clear end. And Delia discovered that on the days Mrs. Rosalie completed something, she slept almost until dawn that night. Delia also began keeping records. At the end of every shift, she sat down and wrote in a large notebook, following the same nursing log format she had always used in the emergency department. Times, medication doses, how much food had been eaten, hours of sleep, how long each period of confusion lasted, what the old woman said, whose name she called, and most importantly, everyone she had come into contact with that day. No one had asked Delia to do it. None of the medical staff before her had done it. Fitch once asked what she could possibly be writing that required so many pages, and Delia replied that it was a professional habit, that without writing things down, she couldn't remember them all. She had no idea that the notebook would one day save the old woman's life. On Sunday of the 3rd week, after returning from visiting Wes, Delia suggested taking Mrs. Rosalie to a nearby park. Raphael came with them, along with 3 guards, and Fitch drove. It was a sunny afternoon, and the park was crowded. Several children were running around the slide in the play area, while their parents stood close behind them, coffee cups in their hands, never taking their eyes off the children for even a second. Mrs. Rosalie sat on a nearby bench. Delia saw her reach into the cloth bag she had brought from home and take out a tin box, and inside were small rolls she had baked at 4 o'clock that morning, each one about the size of her palm. She opened the lid and simply left the box resting on her lap. Barely a minute passed before one child ran over, then another, then 3 arrived at once. They stopped a short distance from the bench, and one of them asked what those were. The old woman said they were rolls she had baked that morning, and asked whether the child wanted one. The child turned to look at his mother. She was standing a few steps away, and she nodded before moving a little closer. Mrs. Rosalie placed a roll into the child's outstretched hand. She didn't touch anyone. She only placed the bread into the waiting palm, then asked, "What's your name?" The child told her. The old woman nodded, repeated the name once to make certain she had it right, then turned to the next child and asked the same question. She asked them one by one. Every child had to say a name before receiving a roll, and she repeated each name as though she expected to see them all again the following morning. For 42 years behind a bakery counter, she had done exactly the same thing with the neighborhood children, and that habit remained perfectly intact within her while so many other things had faded away. The children ate the rolls and laughed, and one of them called toward the others still near the slide that the bread lady was over here, and from then on, that was what all of them called her. 2 mothers came over to thank her. The old woman sat on the bench with the empty tin resting on her lap, and she smiled for the rest of that afternoon. Delia stood a few steps away, and when she turned, she saw Raphael watching his grandmother. He wasn't looking at her the way people watched something sweet or charming. He watched like a man seeing again something he had believed was lost a long time ago. About 65 feet away, Emery Fitch stood apart from the 3 guards, his back turned toward the play area, a telephone pressed to his ear. Delia noticed because he remained there for so long. He listened for nearly 10 minutes and said almost nothing, and when the call ended, he stood for a while longer staring across the grass before returning to the group. On the drive home, the old woman fell asleep in the back seat. Raphael sat beside Delia and remained silent for most of the journey, then said that his grandmother still believed the bakery had burned because of an electrical short. Delia turned toward him. He continued without looking at her, his eyes fixed beyond the window. "When I was 22, the bakery was about to be taken from us. My grandmother didn't know. I hid all the papers. I went to find those men myself. No one forced me, and no one took me there. I walked there alone, and I knew exactly what I was exchanging for what. The bakery survived for another 9 years, long enough for her to keep working the ovens until her hands could no longer lift a tray out. After that, it burned, and she believed it was an electrical fault, and I allowed her to believe it." He fell silent for a while, then spoke the final words very softly. "The old woman sitting behind us believes she raised me to become a decent man, Miss Marsh, and I've spent 12 years making certain she never has to learn that she was wrong." The following morning, while waiting for the oven to heat, Delia noticed something she had seen every day for 3 weeks without ever truly considering it. Mrs. Rosalie always performed the same small ritual before touching the flour. She reached into the pocket of her robe, took out a little leather-bound notebook worn smooth at all 4 corners, placed it on the kitchen island, and rested her palm upon it for about 2 seconds. Then she returned it to her pocket and began kneading. She did this every morning without exception and without saying a word, the way some people made the sign of the cross before a meal. Delia recognized it at once. It was the same notebook that had fallen onto the pharmacy floor that night, the one she had picked up and handed back without looking inside. That morning, she asked about it. She asked very gently while scooping out the flour, "Are your recipes in there, Mrs. Rosalie?" The old woman had been scraping flour from the side of the bowl, and her hand stopped. She didn't look up. "Those aren't recipes, dear," she said. Delia waited. The old woman scraped away the last of the flour, tapped the spoon twice against the rim of the bowl, then began kneading, and she didn't say another word about it for the rest of that morning or on any of the days that followed. That evening, Delia carried Mrs. Rosalie's robe down to the library. The seam beneath the left arm had come apart by nearly 4 inches, and she didn't give it to anyone else to mend because she knew they would simply buy a new one, while the old woman would wear no robe but this one. Delia sat cross-legged on the rug before the fireplace, pulled the sewing basket close, and began stitching. The fire gave enough light to see by, and she preferred sitting on the floor to sitting in a chair, a habit left over from the apartment, where there had been only 2 chairs and one of them had a broken leg. Near 11 o'clock at night, the door opened. Raphael entered, and Delia glanced up once before lowering her eyes and continuing to sew. His tie had been removed and tucked into his coat pocket. The top 2 buttons of his shirt were open, and a dark stain had dried into a stiff patch on the right cuff. He saw that she had noticed it. He said nothing about it. She didn't ask. He crossed to the armchair opposite the fireplace and sat down with the weariness of a man whose body had stopped cooperating several hours earlier, his head falling back against the chair, his eyes closing. The room held only the sound of the fire and the needle passing through cloth. After a while, Delia said without looking up that his grandmother had finished her entire meal that evening. Raphael murmured a quiet acknowledgement. Delia continued, saying that she had remembered his mother's birthday, that she had mentioned it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and said they needed to bake a cake. He opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling for a moment before saying, March 17th. Delia told him that was right, that she had said March 17th. Raphael said nothing more, and neither did she. Delia bit through the thread, threaded the needle again, and turned the robe inside out to finish the inner seam. The silence continued for several minutes, and at some point she realized that it had changed. 3 weeks earlier, whenever the 2 of them occupied the same room, they had both sat with straight backs, each watching the other in a different way. Now he was drifting in and out of sleep in the armchair with dried blood on his cuff, while she sat on the floor repairing his grandmother's robe, and neither of them felt any need to speak. She finished near midnight, bit off the thread, tested the seam by pulling gently at both ends, then folded the robe and placed it over the arm of the chair. She stood, but after rising, she didn't leave immediately. She walked to the drinks cart in the corner, picked up the bottle in the center, poured about 2 fingers into a glass, and carried it back to the small table beside his chair. Raphael opened his eyes. He looked at the glass, then up at her. "You pay me too much," Delia said. "I have to find extra work to make myself worth the money." Then she picked up the robe and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard him make a brief sound. It might have been a laugh. It might not have been. She didn't turn around to find out. Only after reaching the hallway did she stop, and she stood there for a moment with the folded robe in her arms. There was something small and hard inside one of its pockets, and she could feel it through the fabric. Rectangular, with 4 worn corners. She left it exactly where it was, carried the robe upstairs to the old woman's room, and hung it in its usual place, on the hook to the left of the wardrobe, where Mrs. Rosalie reached for it every morning at 4 o'clock. 3 days later, Emery Fitch knocked on her bedroom door at nearly 9 o'clock in the evening. He wasn't carrying a tea tray. He stood in the doorway with a brown document envelope tucked beneath one arm and asked whether she had a few minutes. Delia invited him inside, but he didn't enter. He remained where he was, placed the envelope in her hands, and said there were certain things a person ought to know before signing anything else. She asked what it was. Fitch said that he was sorry, and he spoke those 3 words in a voice Delia couldn't understand. Not the voice of someone who had done something wrong, but the voice of someone preparing to do something he himself didn't believe was right. Then he left. Delia opened the envelope while sitting on the edge of the bed. The first page was a copy of the report from Wes's accident, dated September 19th, 3 years earlier. On the road beside the Eastern Industrial District, a light truck, the driver identified at the scene. She had read that report before, had read it dozens of times, and knew every line by heart. But behind it were papers she had never seen. A notice from the district attorney's office stating that no prosecution would proceed because of insufficient evidence, dated November 20th of that same year. A report noting that 2 witnesses had withdrawn their statements. A document authorizing legal representation, and on the back, copies of 2 transfers covering the defense fees, paid by a limited liability company registered at an office building near the harbor. The final page was a hand-drawn ownership chart, connecting that company through 2 intermediary layers to a name Delia had first heard in the basement staff break room at 3 o'clock in the morning. She remained motionless for a very long time. Then she carried the entire file down to the study and didn't knock. Raphael was standing beside the desk. She placed the papers on the wooden surface and said, "Read it." She continued as he turned the pages, her voice growing drier with every sentence, saying that her brother had been 21 when it happened, that over the past 3 years she had called the district attorney's office 14 times, and all 14 times she had been told the case was closed, that she had stood in a courthouse hallway for 2 consecutive mornings, waiting for a trial that never took place. "I've been sitting in your house for 3 weeks," she said. "I've kneaded dough with your grandmother at 4 o'clock in the morning. I've mended her clothes. And for all of the past 3 years, the thing that took a trial away from my brother was this house." Raphael didn't look up. He turned to the page containing the copies of the transfers and remained there for a long time. Then he said that he had never heard of the case. Delia gave a short laugh and said, "Of course you haven't." He looked up, and she saw his face, and she fell silent. There was no denial in his expression. There was none of the calculation she had seen in the basement break room. There was only something entirely different, the expression of a man who had opened the door to his own home and discovered that every piece of furniture had been moved. "I know every action taken in my name during the past 3 years, Miss Marsh," he said. "That's my responsibility. I have to know. But I didn't know about this." Then he picked up the chart and asked who had given it to her. Delia didn't answer that question. She pointed to a line on one of the transfer records, the line containing the payer's account number, and said that she had seen the number somewhere before. Raphael followed her finger. He opened a desk drawer and removed another sheet of paper, the report his men had brought him on the afternoon he declared that everything had been handled. He placed the 2 pages beside each other. The 2 men who had waited for Delia in the underground garage had been paid from the same account that had covered the legal fees 3 years earlier. It wasn't money from a rival faction. It wasn't money from outside. Raphael stood completely still, and Delia watched the truth reach him one step at a time, that he had gone after the wrong people, that he had dealt with the wrong people, and that by doing so, he had severed with his own hands the only thread that might have led back into this house. Very softly, almost to himself, he said that he had closed the wrong door. "I'm leaving," Delia said. He told her to wait. She replied that she had a contract, Clause 6, that she could enter and leave whenever she wished without asking anyone's permission, and that he was the one who had agreed to that clause. Raphael said nothing more. She went upstairs, packed her belongings into the cloth bag she had brought on her first day, called a taxi from her own telephone, and went down to wait in the entrance hall. 2 guards stood by the door. Both watched her. Neither stepped forward. Neither said a word, because she wasn't being held in that house, and every one of them knew it. Fitch wasn't in the hall. The taxi's headlights appeared beyond the first gate, 2 yellow points climbing the hillside. Delia adjusted the strap of her bag, and at that exact moment, from the direction of the kitchen at the end of the corridor, Mrs. Rosalie called out. She called for Maria twice, then 3 times, her voice rising with every call, the name of an assistant who had died in 1979. The clock on the entrance hall wall showed 10:40 in the evening. It wasn't the hour when she normally woke. It wasn't time to knead the dough. That was the first thing Delia thought. The second was that the old woman wasn't wearing her slippers. The taxi stopped outside the front steps and sounded its horn once, briefly. Delia lowered the bag onto the stone floor. She stayed for another 11 days, and during those 11 days, no one in the house mentioned what had happened that night. Not Fitch, not Raphael. By January, the snow had grown deep, and the surface of the bay had frozen into broad gray sheets. On the night of January 17th, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Delia was asleep when the sound woke her. It didn't wail. It was a deep, low vibration running through the stone foundation and the frame of the bed, the kind of sound a person felt in the bones before hearing it with the ears, and with it came red lights flashing along the base of the hallway walls. She sat upright at once. She didn't freeze for even a second. 8 years of night shifts had built a certain order into her, and it awakened before fear had time to reach her. Shoes, coat, and the first question in her mind wasn't what was happening, but where her patient was. She ran along the second-floor hallway toward the old woman's room. The door stood slightly open. The blankets had been thrown aside. The bed was empty. Her slippers remained untouched at its foot. Delia turned and ran toward the main staircase, and on the landing, she nearly collided with 2 men in dark clothing coming up in the opposite direction. One of them told her to return to her room and lock the door. She asked where the old woman was. He said the safe room in the north wing, that Team 4 was already heading there, then moved her aside and continued running. Delia remained on the landing for nearly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, she looked down into the entrance hall below and saw what everyone rushing around her had failed to see. The main doors had been breached. 4 strangers had entered the house, and 3 of them were climbing the western staircase, and they passed directly by the corridor leading to the main bedroom, without a single one of them turning toward it. No one stopped at that door. No one tried the handle. They moved past it and continued upward, and the direction they were taking was the north wing. Delia stood with one hand gripping the banister, and the whole truth came to her at once, clear and cold as a test result appearing on a screen. They hadn't come for Raphael. Had they come for him, someone would have stopped at that door. They had come for the old woman. And she understood the rest of it too, the part she had been stumbling over for weeks without being able to explain. The two men in the underground garage had only been a test. They had thrown her into his path to see how he would react. And on the night Raphael Orsini walked down that garage ramp and didn't stop until someone told him to, everyone who needed to know had learned exactly what they wanted. They had found the place where he lost control. Now they had come to take it. Delia spun around and ran, but she didn't run toward the north wing. She ran downstairs toward the kitchen, because it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and the old woman usually rose at 4. But a vibration running through the stone floor sounded very much like an oven alarm, and inside Mrs. Rosalie's mind, there was no year, no house, only a task that had to be done at that hour. The kitchen was empty. The side door at the far end, the one leading into the back garden and the path along the cliff, stood slightly open, and cold wind blew inward through the gap. The indicator on the electronic keypad beside the door was still green. For 3 weeks, Delia had watched the old woman enter that code on the mornings when her mind was clear. June 20th, 1946, her wedding day. The one number in the entire house she remembered more clearly than her own grandson's name. And beneath the keypad, the sensor light for that entire section wasn't flashing. It was dark. It had been dark before the old woman opened the door. Delia rushed outside. The snow reached her ankles. The wind swept upward from the bay and struck the cliffside, and she saw Mrs. Rosalie about 100 feet away, a small figure in a night robe walking along the path toward the slope, barefoot, taking slow and certain steps like someone following a road she had traveled for 42 years. Delia didn't shout. She didn't run forward and seize her. She had learned long ago that a person lost inside a memory mustn't be dragged away from it. If they were pulled, they resisted. And resistance in a place like this meant falling. She circled ahead of the old woman, slowed when she was 3 steps away, and called to her gently. Mrs. Rosalie stopped. She looked at Delia, and there was nothing in her eyes, then said that she had to go down and open the shop because the customers would arrive at 6 o'clock. Delia removed her coat, stepped closer, and draped it around the old woman's shoulders. She did it as calmly as though placing a shawl around a patient in a clinic. Then she took Mrs. Rosalie's hand, a hand already stiff with cold, enclosed it between both of her palms, and lied. She said, "The snow is too heavy today, Mrs. Rosalie. No one will be able to get to the market." The old woman turned her head toward the sea. The snow truly was falling thickly, and the wind drove it across the path in long white streaks. The proof stood directly before her. Delia continued, "Let's close the shop today, and we'll make up for it tomorrow." Mrs. Rosalie watched the snow for a little longer. Then her shoulders lowered, and she said, "Close the shop." She repeated it once more softly. "Close the shop," then allowed Delia to turn her around and guide her back uphill. They had taken barely 10 steps when the first explosion came from the front courtyard, beyond the stone wall of the greenhouse. Raphael came from the direction of the front courtyard, running up the path toward them, and he didn't say a single word. He simply wrapped an arm around each woman's shoulders and pushed them both into the narrow space behind the greenhouse's stone wall, the only place on that entire slope protected by anything thicker than a sheet of glass. Delia fell backward into the snow with the old woman in her arms. 2 more explosions came from the courtyard, followed by the sound of running feet, and then silence. She looked up and saw Raphael still standing with one hand braced against the stone wall, and she knew before he fell, not because she saw anything, because she heard the rhythm of his breathing change, and after 8 years in the emergency department, that rhythm had only one meaning. He collapsed beside the wall. Delia settled the old woman against the stone, removed her own scarf and wrapped it around Mrs. Rosalie's knees, then turned toward Raphael and became someone entirely different. She shouted to the 2 guards who had just come running, and her voice cut through every other sound in the courtyard. "2 of you carry him, one supporting his shoulders and one supporting his hips. Don't bend his body. You take his grandmother inside, wrap her in blankets, and don't let her look out here. Get the doctor to the medical room right now." No one asked what authority she had to give orders. They obeyed because at that moment, there was only one person in the courtyard who knew what she was doing. In the medical room, She cut open Raphael's clothes with trauma shears, pressed gauze against the wound, and drove the full weight of her body through both hands. She placed 2 fingers against his neck and counted while watching the second hand on the wall clock, and the number she found wasn't the number she wanted. She counted again 40 seconds later, and it was worse. Raphael opened his eyes. He searched for her face and managed one sentence. "Where's my grandmother?" Delia told him she was inside, that someone had wrapped her in blankets, and that she hadn't seen anything. He closed his eyes again. Delia called his name, called it once more, louder this time, and tapped his cheek until he opened his eyes. "Look at me," she said. "Look at me. You're not allowed to die tonight." He managed 3 words. "Why is that?" Delia never stopped applying pressure. "Because who's going to light the oven for her at 4 o'clock tomorrow morning?" she answered. Something trembled once inside his chest, perhaps a laugh, and then disappeared. The family's private physician rushed in and opened his equipment case, and Delia watched him work for about 30 seconds before saying, "You can't manage this here." He looked up and argued. She said, "Don't argue, just listen to the numbers." She gave him the pulse, the breathing rate, the color of the skin at Raphael's extremities, and the amount of blood that had soaked through 4 layers of gauze in 2 minutes. Then she told him that this room had no blood bank, no operating room, and no ventilator, and that if he opened Raphael here, he wouldn't be able to close him again. The doctor said that taking the head of the family to a hospital was something no one in that house was permitted to do. Delia asked how he intended to explain his death to the old woman. He didn't answer. Raphael had already lost consciousness. Delia stood there with both hands, maintaining pressure, fully aware that the only person with the authority to decide for him was lying beneath her hands. She considered everything for exactly 4 seconds. Then she told the nearest guard to give her his phone, pressed 3 digits, and gave the dispatcher the address of the house in the calm voice of an emergency nurse reporting a case. Male, 34 years old, gunshot wound, rapid weak pulse, severe blood loss, ambulance required with a physician on board. There were 4 men in the room, and all 4 stared at her, yet not one of them dared take the phone from her hand. She clearly said the words, "gunshot wound," and she knew exactly what those words meant. They meant a real hospital record would be created. They meant the hospital would be legally required to notify the police. They meant that within 40 minutes, the house where no official vehicle had passed beyond the first gate in 20 years would have uniformed officers standing in its entrance hall. She ended the call, returned the phone, and continued pressing the gauze. While they waited, she asked someone to take over the pressure for 1 minute and stepped into the entrance hall to wash her hands. The security management screen mounted on the wall was still glowing, and Delia stopped in front of it. She had watched Fitch use that screen for 3 weeks, so she knew how to open the system log. She scrolled down to the area sensors, found the kitchen side door, and saw it. At 11:47 that night, the southeast sector sensor had been switched to disabled status using an administrator code. It wasn't a system error. It wasn't a power failure. Someone had turned it off 3 hours before the main doors were breached. And in the entire house, only 2 people knew that code. Delia stared at the line for about 5 seconds. Then she turned off the screen, returned to the medical room, and didn't say a word to anyone. 40 minutes later, 2 sets of lights swept up the hillside and passed through all 3 iron gates of the Orsini estate, the red and white lights of an ambulance and the blue and red lights of a police car, and it was the first time that had happened in 20 years. The hospital created an official record that very night, and by morning, 2 investigators were sitting in the 3rd-floor corridor. For 20 years, not a single document bearing the name Raphael Orsini had ever entered the city's system, and now one existed, a record of a gunshot wound, with the date, the time, the address, and the name of the person who had called for emergency assistance. Delia had signed the space reserved for the medical professional present at the scene with her own true name. Raphael regained consciousness on the afternoon of the 2nd day. The first person he asked about was his grandmother. The second was Delia. When he was alert enough to hear the entire account, they told him who had dialed those 3 digits, what she had said into the telephone, and who had signed the record. He lay still for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Then he asked Delia to come closer. She stood beside the bed and waited, and she had prepared herself for almost anything. "For 20 years, no one has dared make a decision for me," he said. "You were the first, and you made the right one." Emery Fitch came of his own accord. No one went looking for him, and no one detained him. He simply walked into the hospital room that evening and sat in the chair beside the door, Delia showed him the line from the system log, the time, and the administrator code, and he looked at it and nodded. He didn't deny a single thing. He said that 3 years earlier, his son had been behind the wheel of the light truck on the Eastern Road. He said he had used the Orsini name to do everything that had needed to be done, hiring attorneys, meeting with witnesses, and he had done all of it behind the back of the man lying in that hospital bed because he knew with certainty that permission would never have been given if he had asked. He said he had lived in peace for 3 years, until the previous autumn, when someone came to him, showed him those exact documents, and told him that he could either cooperate or his son wouldn't live through the winter. He had disabled the censor. He had handed over Delia's license plate number, and he had also been the one who placed the file in her hands that night because he knew something would happen on the 17th, and the only way he could think of to drive her away from the house was to give her a reason to hate every one of them. When he had finished, he placed the house keys on the table and sat waiting. Raphael didn't raise his voice once. He only asked where Fitch's son was now, and Fitch named a city in the west, and Raphael ordered his men to bring the young man back before the other side could reach him. Then he told Fitch that he would have to answer to the law for what he had done, and that Raphael wouldn't interfere in either direction, neither helping him nor pushing him further down. Fitch said thank you, and he meant it. 3 days later, the family council gathered in the great sitting room. They repeated that the old woman was a leak, that the night of the 17th was proof, that the 60 days hadn't yet expired, but the truth had already become too clear to ignore. Delia asked permission to speak. She placed her nursing journal on the table. 3 weeks of handwritten records, 1 page for every day. Times, medication doses, food intake, sleeping hours, the length of every episode of confusion, everything the old woman had said, every name she had called, and at the bottom of every page was a line Delia had written consistently without any particular purpose. A list of everyone Mrs. Rosalie had come into contact with that day. She let them turn the pages themselves. There wasn't a single unfamiliar name, not one telephone call, not one visitor, not one occasion when the old woman had left the grounds except for the afternoon in the park, when 4 people had accompanied her. During these 3 weeks, Delia said, Mrs. Rosalie spoke to an outsider only once, in a pharmacy at 2 o'clock in the morning, and that outsider was me. Your leak isn't the old woman. It's the person who held the administrator code. No one in the room could answer her. What kept Mrs. Rosalie in her own home that night wasn't gunfire, wealth, or power. It was a stack of pages, carefully filled out every day by a night shift nurse, because professional habit had taught her to write everything down. 1 week later, on a morning when her mind was clear, Mrs. Rosalie sat beside Delia in the kitchen and took the leather-bound notebook from the pocket of her robe. She placed it in Delia's hands and said, Look, dear, I told you, these aren't recipes. Delia opened it. Inside were tightly packed columns of handwriting, stretching from the first page almost to the last, and every line contained a name, a date, and an amount of money. 42 years of people who had come for bread without having the money to pay, people who had lost their jobs, people who had just given birth, people who had just buried their husbands, people who had simply been hungry during some week in some forgotten year. And beside almost every line was a stroke drawn through the debt in the same handwriting, a mark Mrs. Rosalie had made with her own hand to erase what was owed. Delia turned back toward the oldest pages, where the paper had yellowed and the ink had faded. On a page marked for a winter 30 years earlier in southeast Baltimore, she saw her mother's name, Colleen Marsh. Beside it were a few words, widowed, 2 young children. Beneath that were 7 consecutive entries, 7 weeks, 7 occasions when bread had been taken on credit. All 7 had been crossed out. Delia sat for a very long time with the notebook open on her lap. 30 years earlier, the woman sitting beside her had fed Delia's entire family through a winter and had never asked for a single cent in return, had never told anyone what she had done, and now no longer remembered it herself. That night in the pharmacy, when Delia placed $14.20 on the counter for a stranger, she had repaid a real debt without ever knowing she carried it. Raphael read the page twice. He had lived his entire adult life by a single rule, that an Orsini owed no one, and he had traded everything he possessed to avoid owing anyone anything. Now he sat there and understood that the woman he had sacrificed everything to protect had spent 42 years erasing other people's debts, and that not for a single day had she wanted him to become what he had become. That afternoon, he called Delia into his office. He gave her 2 things. The first was the completed paperwork for a lifetime trust that would cover every expense related to Wesley Marsh's treatment and rehabilitation, already established and effective from before the night of the 17th, with no conditions and no signature tying Delia to anything. The second was the entire original file from the accident, including the chart showing the company's ownership structure. He placed it in her hands and told her to do whatever she wished with it, including taking it to the district attorney, even though doing so meant the law would walk directly into his own house. She submitted it. He didn't try to stop her. He didn't make a single telephone call. And that was how he told her he had changed, more clearly than any words ever could. Then he gave her the final thing, a thin envelope containing documents for another name, another city, and a place where she could begin again and never be found. Delia picked it up, turned it over in her hands exactly twice, then folded it and placed it on the tray beside the glass of water. "I worked the night shift for 8 years, sir," she said. "I don't abandon a patient in the middle of a shift, and now this entire house is my patient." Raphael looked at her, and the cold expression that terrified the whole city broke apart completely, leaving only an exhausted man who was smiling. He told her she was the most stubborn woman he had ever met. She replied that his security system was terrible, that he needed to drink his water, and that he looked awful. Then she walked out, and the door closed very softly behind her. Delia Marsh's story reminds us that kindness doesn't have to be grand to matter. Sometimes it is only $14.20 placed on a counter at 2 o'clock in the morning, only one hand holding another when no one is watching, and yet that can be enough to bring an entire human soul back home. Her story also reminds us that an elderly person's dignity doesn't disappear with their memory. What they need isn't to be corrected every time they remember something differently, but to have someone willing to walk beside them along the road they are still traveling within their hearts. And in the end, a person's true strength isn't measured by how much money they possess, but by the things they refuse to sell at any price. If tonight's story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with the people you love. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that every day you'll have more meaningful stories to listen to. How did the story of Delia and Mrs. Rosalie make you feel? And if you had been in Delia's place, would you have done what she did? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.